So we're in chapter 20. We are discussing the concept of, no, we finished chapter 20. Didn't we finish chapter 20? Let me look inside. I think we finished chapter 20 and we started chapter 21. Maybe we didn't.
No, we did.
We did start chapter 21?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, I'm like, no, we did this. Okay, yes. How far we got in chapter 21, Lisa?
Let's see. We just started it. Let me see if I have any notes that might.
What's the last thing you have written down?
I remember reading God's speech is called speech only in order to illustrate that quality of revelation.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate
You're
that.
welcome.
Thank you. I always wonder, how am I going to remember next week where I'm up to? Like, a lot of different things happen over the course of a week, so you might forget. But then we have Lisa, so we're fine. Okay. So in chapter 20, we discussed the idea of God's speech, looking at our speech, and understanding how just as our speech doesn't impact us, it doesn't add to me, it doesn't diminish to me, the worlds that are all a product of God's speech don't in any way impact him. We don't add to him, we don't diminish from him. It's just speech. Now in chapter 21, we say, wait a minute. We're saying God is speaking, but his speech is fundamentally different than mine. How do I know it's fundamentally different? For a very simple reason. When I speak, the words leave me. When God speaks, nothing leaves him. So if it doesn't leave him, why are we calling it speech? And we explain the act of speech in essence means a communication, a revelation of self to something else. We said when it's a process of self-revelation, when I'm revealing to myself, it's called thought. And you could think out loud, but it's still called thought. But when I'm revealing to someone else, when I'm communicating with someone else, that's called speech. And that's what God is doing. Who's the else that God is communicating to? Creation. So there's God, and God is exposing himself, uncovering himself, conveying something to the else of creation. And that's why we call what he's doing speech. So it's fundamentally different than ours. The fundamental difference is by me, my speech leaves me and has a life of its own. By God, nothing leaves him. So therefore, and again, we said this chapter we could view as focusing on the mistake creations of godliness can have, how they experience their own existence. Next chapter, chapter 22, is going to focus on the mistake creations of Klippa, creations of an evil nature can have, and how they understand their own existence. But chapter 21 is creations of godliness. So what is the mistake that creations of godliness are making? Obviously, they know God created them. That's not their mistake. Obviously, know their entire being is God. That's not their mistake. But their mistake is they're viewing speech, so to speak, like we understand speech. You speak and then the words leave you. And the words exist on their own. And that's the mistake creations of godliness are making. They know they're completely God's energy. They know they're God's energy of speech. They know their whole fabric and being is godliness. But they think God spoke and now they exist separate from his existence. But there is nothing separate from his existence. That's the point. Their speech, they're his energy, they're his breath, and they're still absolutely one with him. So to continue this concept, so we're in chapter 21. We probably up to Kaf Lamaila. So that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 lines from the beginning of the chapter. Kaf Lamaila, so to above by God, Be'ein Sof Baruch Hu, in the infinity of God's existence, Yitzias ha'or v'achayus mimenu yisparech, the emission the expression of the light, of the vitality from him, from God. From a state of concealment. Concealment meaning what we're calling concealment. Totally enveloped within God's reality. To revelation, meaning what we're calling revelation, that now this energy is expressed outward and there's a recipient of this energy. There's a being that's receiving this infinite God energy. Now, why is God doing this? Well, this is creation. Livraya olamais, to create the world, ulhachayosam, and to vivify them, because we said creation constantly has to be recreated for it to exist. Nikra b'shem dibor. That's what we mean by the term speech when we're talking about God. The foundational primordial speech of God are the 10 utterances with which he created and has been saying ever since to keep creating all of creation. And we said those are the 10 times in the very first chapter in Genesis, in Bereshit, in the very first chapter of all of Torah. The very first verse is a first statement. Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning God created, or for the sake of the first, God created. And then 9 times in that chapter where it says, and God said, let there be. There are 9 such statements in that chapter. Add it all together, those are 10 statements that God began saying 5,781 years ago, and he's been saying ever since. And if you ever stop saying them, everything would cease to exist. And so to all the rest of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim, anything that we're saying God said, that the prophets grasped with the vision of their prophecy. Okay, so we did have some people join us. We're in the middle of reading that. This is a deep section. So let's review what we're talking about here. We are in chapter 21. We are continuing our discussion of creation as speech. We are understanding the ramifications of speech in terms of ultimately understanding how creation in no way changed God. It's not that there first was God and now there's God plus something else called creation, or now there's God minus something else because of creation. It didn't make a plus, it didn't make a minus, it didn't change him at all. So last chapter we said it didn't change him at all because speech doesn't really affect the person who's speaking. There's so many different steps as we enumerated. The word, from the source of words, from the source of thought, from the feeling in the heart, from the subconscious thought, to the 10 powers of the soul, to the soul itself. There's so many layers between that and the word. Obviously, the word isn't adding or diminishing you, the soul, the being from which this word emanates ultimately. And obviously, how much more so God in his infinity is no way added or diminished by the words that are creation, because all of creation is godly words. That's what everything we and all of creation, all physical and all spiritual creation, is godly words, constantly being resaid. Now, we said that last chapter. In this chapter, we're saying, let's get a little deeper and let's lay out a few axioms, a few basic important concepts we have to remember. One, God's speech is very different than ours. By him, he says it, and it's still within him. By us, we say it, and it's gone. But still, we call it speech. Why do we call it speech? Because when I speak and when God speaks, in essence, the same essence process is happening. The essence process that is happening is there's an outward revelation. There's a revelation to something else. I'm talking to you. You're the else that I'm talking to. By God, it's creation. So when God said and recess for 5,781 years, the 10 utterances that created and create all, that means there's an expression from him, from a state that we don't see it, that not we, me, my eyes, that nothing can see it, to be now in a space that can be absorbed by something else. That's God's speech. And similarly, the Rebbe says, throughout all of Torah, throughout all the prophets, throughout all the writings, all of the scriptures, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim, whenever it says, and God said, this is what it means. There's an expression of God's energy that is now being received by someone else. So in the prophets and the writings, the recipient is generally the prophet. In Torah, the recipient might be Moses. It might be the entire Jewish nation. It might be the entire world. But there's a recipient of God's energy. God's energy is coming out of him and being absorbed by someone else. So the person that's absorbing it, the prophet, is going to take that energy he experienced and articulate it in words. And those are the words of prophecy. But just to understand this a little bit, if somebody else received that exact same energy, the words might be slightly different, or maybe not. It depends on the parameters and ability of the person who was receiving this energy to digest it and then express it properly to the rest of the Jewish people. So the prophet is absorbing this energy and then articulating it in words for everyone else. If it was a prophecy it might have just been a personal prophecy for him, but it was a prophecy to share with others. He's taking this energy he received and articulating it in words as he is processing that energy. So God's the initiator, he's the recipient, and we're calling what's happening between the two speech. Any questions on any of this so far? Okay. You can definitely feel free to ask questions. All right, so continuing. Now his, so to speak, thought and speech, so to speak, because when we say thought and speech, we mean it in a very human context, and we're talking about God's thought and God's speech. Obviously, that's quite different than ours, but at the same time, there's this commonality, and that's why we're calling it thought, and that's why we're calling it speech. Again, thought, revelation to self; speech, revelation outward to creation. Miyuchados imo betachlis hayichud. We are hammering in this point. Are absolutely one with him to the ultimate degree of one. To what degree? Now I'm going to give you a metaphor. Derech mashal, because I want you to understand this. Because I'm saying to you that God, after he speaks, the words never leave him. And you say, okay. And I say, any questions? And you say, no questions. But you don't really understand the word I'm saying, because we can't understand that, because that's not what speech means to us. If we think about it, I'm speaking and the words leave me, and they're being recorded on this Zoom, and the words can go on and travel all over the world, let's say. I mean, those words have a life of their own. Well, God's speaking, but his words never leave him. So what does that mean? So to give us a feel for it, the Rebbe is saying metaphorically, God's speech, after he says it, is like the speech and thought of a person when it's still in the power of his thought. Oh, or even more deeply, in the desires of his heart. Remember, subconscious, heart, conscious thought. So God's speech after he says it is like when mine is still in my mind, or even deeper than my mind, in the desires of my heart that has not yet been articulated even as thought. Before it even got up to the brain to consciously think about it, in a lettered process, in a language. Because then by man, all of this that came afterwards, the letters, the words of speech that originate in the language of thought, originates and is invested in the unlettered, before letters, feeling in the heart. And there it's absolutely one. There's nothing to be besides one, because there's nothing being. There's no words yet on any level. They're absolutely enrooted in their source. Which goes back to even a prior level of subconscious intellect and desire. So the Rebbe is saying, to put this very concisely, God's speech after he says it is as one as ours is with us before we even think it. Remember last chapter we learned conscious thought is coming from a feeling in the heart, which is coming from subconscious thought. So it's as if to say God's speech after he says it is like our speech when it's still embedded in our subconscious, before it even emerged to our heart, or when it's in our heart, before it even became a conscious thought in our mind. That's how one his speech is with him after he speaks it. Like mine is with me before I think it. Wow, that's really one, because I haven't thought it yet. So it is me. Right, that's the point. Before you think your thought, where is that thought? Well, it's embedded somewhere in my heart. It's embedded somewhere in my subconscious. So separate that from you. I can't. It is me. There's nothing to separate yet. There's no words. There's no letters. There's no thing to separate. Right, the Rebbe says. That's my point. Just as by you, there's nothing to separate. It hasn't emerged yet to a state that you could separate it. That's like how God is with him after he says it. Now, what is this speech we're talking about? We're talking about creation. All of creation is God's speech. So creation, God's speech, my pen, is as one with God now as if it was still embedded in my subconscious or in the feeling state of my heart that it hasn't even come to my brain to consciously think about a pen, let alone to talk about a pen. That's how this pen exists in God's reality, which is very significant because the words we're talking about are creation. So the thing that's so one with God, it like doesn't even have articulation yet, is all of creation. All of creation is that one with God. So last chapter we said creation did not change God because creation is speech and speech doesn't impact you. Now the Rebbe is saying creation did not change God because creation is speech and God's speech is one with him. Is so deeply one with him, there's no addition or subtraction. It's him. And that's why creation did not change God. Any questions on any of this? Okay. Continuing. וככה ממש דרך מיוחדות דיבור המחשב של הקדוש ברוך הוא ותכלס הייחוד במהוסו ועצמוסו יסברך, גם אחר שיצא דיבור יסברך על הפועל ובריאס העולמות. And so too, literally, just as we've now created this analogy of human speech and prior to speech and in your heart and in your subconscious to understand, well, that's what's going on with God. It's fused with him, his speech and his thoughts, to such a degree of oneness in his essence and being, also after, so to speak, he spoke them. What do you mean he spoke them? Well, the pen exists. There's creation. He spoke these words and he is constantly speaking these words. That's why my pen is still existing. But it's as one with him as if it was still in the subconscious. Just as it was fused with him before the creation of the world. So what we're saying is the same degree, I'm picking out my pen here, the same way this pen existed before God spoke it into existence is the same way it exists after he spoke it into existence, meaning from God's end. From my end, there's a big difference. Now there's a pen. from God's end, prior to and post is the same thing. Because prior to him saying the words, the pen was one with him, the energy. This pen is a godly energy, it's godly words. So the godly energy that is now I'm holding in my fingers and calling it a pen, that godly energy was with him originally. And that godly energy is still with him. Well, in the interim, he spoke the words and he's still speaking them because my pen's existing. True. That's from my end, from the recipient's end. But from his end, from the speaker's end, these words were with me before, these words are with me after, and there's no change in the oneness that these words are part of my existence. That's how God experiences the reality. But I experience the reality that, well, now there's a pen and before there wasn't, so to speak. But that's just because I'm the recipient, that I'm now privy to hear his thoughts. But it's not thoughts, it's really words. But I'm privy to hear it. But it's still one with him as if he never said it in the first place. Any questions on this? Okay. The ain't shum shinoi klal lefanav yisbarach. So by God, there's no change, right? We said in the previous chapter, there's no change because words don't affect you. In this chapter, there's no change because the words never left you. Because from your reality, originally it was just you, and now it's just you. All those words, they're all absolutely one within me. To the same degree as before I ever said them, that's how one they are within me now after I spoke them. So there's no change. So by God's end, there's no change. As I said, the energy vivifying this pen was always one with him, is always one with him, and will always be one with him. So therefore, there's no change. It didn't affect me at all because nothing changed. What happened? I shared it outward. But even as I shared it outward, I retained it inward. So nothing changed. That's from God's end. El Habruim. But that's not how creation processes it. From creation's end, there's a huge change. We now exist. So from the pen's perspective, there's a big change. From my perspective, there's a big change. From God's perspective, there's no change at all. So all the recipients of his speech, which means of their vitality and life, from our end, there's a very massive change. We didn't exist, and now we do exist. That's a change. But that's just by me. That's not from God's end. Because from our end, there was an experiential thing that happened. These words left God, but they didn't. But I think they did. Oh, that's what I meant. That's the mistake of creations of godliness. Remember I told you this a few minutes ago? So I'm going to say it again here. I said that chapter 20 was sort of an overview of the concept. And chapter 21, we could view as clarifying or rectifying the mistake of creations of godliness. And chapter 22 as rectifying the mistake of creations of klipa, of evil. This is the mistake of godliness. It's a very subtle mistake. It's saying, God, I'm all God. My only energy is God. There's nothing here but God words, which now exist outside of him because God created me. I'm godly energy. I'm not anything else but godly energy, but outside of him because he spoke me into existence. And God says, no, that's a mistake. You're still absolutely one within me, even as you now have a sense of separate existence. It's illusionary. It's an illusion. It's a deliberate illusion, but it's not real. God says, because you never left me. Even as you were spoken, even as you emerged, even as you now exist, you never left me. But of course, from our end, it does feel quite different. And that's supposed to be that way. If we knew the reality, first of all, we would cease to exist because we'd be so overwhelmed by the energy. And we also would completely lose the whole point and purpose of it all. That we know the purpose of creation is for us to freely choose God. If we understood the truth that we are God, that no ego, me and the pen and the computer I'm looking into right now and the piece of paper, it's all God. It's absolutely God. And it's all totally one with God. Well, there goes my free choice out the window, right? What's free choice when everything is God? There is no choice but to be subsumed in God, but to absolutely serve him as an extension of self. Not as a mistake of godliness, an extension of self that emerged and is now separate, but as a truth, as an extension of self that still extends, that's still part of its origin, right? As you can envision, my hands, my fingers, my arm are an extension of my body, but they're part of my body. That's the truth. And we even meaning the highest angels, the highest godly forces, feel they're an extension that have separated. You're an extension that's still absolutely one. So if we got it, if we understood the secrets, if we understood and fathomed the mystery of creation, first of all, we would cease to exist because we'd be blown away by the godly energy. And second of all, we would feel like we would lose our purpose of existence, so to speak. Because the purpose is for me to feel separate and uncover that I am one. And that's the whole movement of my work and my growth. And every time I achieve another godly milestone, it's another bit of that self-awareness, that real self-awareness, that God and I are one. So that's the truth. But it's a truth we have to come to through our own work. So don't worry, I'm not spilling the beans and now your work is done. Because even though I'm saying these words and you're hopefully listening and absorbing and understanding, it still hasn't become something you feel in your fingers and your toes. And for that, you still have to do the work. And that's what's going to happen by Mashiach, when we have the complete revelation of Mashiach, that we, not just we as people, not just we as Jews, the entire world, the pens of the world, everything of the world will have that flash of awareness of self as an absolute, fluid oneness with God's self, which will take the entire world and be the most humbling experience ever experienced. Humbling in terms of the true definition of humbling, that there's no self. Because all of self is part of God's reality. And for the Jew, who will experience his true reality, it will be such an awakening. It will be different than the rest of the world. Because we're not just like the pen, that godliness which is still one with God. We're that piece of God. And when each one of us wakes up to understand we are that piece of God, it's the most ultimate transformative moment of what is really my existence? And now let me live it. Any questions on any of this? Okay, remember, you can ask your question, you can chat your question, you can chat it privately to me. All works.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Baruch Hashem, good.
Does that mean things are settled down a bit?
Not yet, but listen,
Okay.
I
But
need to
get to class.
I need to get to class. That's the only thing that keeps me sane,
I totally understand.
So, Baruch Hashem. But you were talking about the mistakes. Actually, in a way, the mistakes that God made But it's actually the mistakes
Not
that
the
we
mistake
make.
that God made. God doesn't make mistakes.
Exactly,
The
exactly.
creations of godliness, meaning all of creation,
Okay.
everything God created, I can simply put in two categories: creations of godliness, creations of, I'm going to use the term evil.
Klipa.
Right.
Yes.
Everything falls in one of those two categories. It's a creation of godliness, of kedusha. It's a creation of evil, of klipa. That's everything. Everything
Right.
falls in one of those two categories.
Right.
So in this chapter, in chapter 21, we're exposing the very subtle mistake of creations of godliness. Do creations of godliness know God created them? Yes. Do they know their whole fabric and being is godliness? Yes. Are they aware that they still are under and contain God's energy? Yes. So what's their mistake? Their mistake is a very subtle mistake, feeling that God creates them, that they're God's energy that has emerged and is currently outside of him, like my words. My words are me. My words are my breath. My words are me, but once I say them, they're me outside of me. So creations of godliness think we're godliness outside of God, which is a very plausible mistake, but it's a mistake. What is their mistake? That there's nothing outside of God. And that's what we're saying. God's words, after he says them, are as one with him as our words before we think them. So these words, this godly energy that was said by God, is still one with God. That's their mistake. That's a very critical mistake, because we are trying to understand how God can say, as he says in the writings, the Malachi and the prophets, I, God, did not change. And how can he say he didn't change? First, it was just him, and now there's him, plus a lot of other stuff. But if we understand all that other stuff is him, and from his end, there's no difference before he said it and after he said it, when it was still within him and it would emerge from him. Because when it emerged from him, from his end, it's as one with him as before he even thought it. So then creation didn't change it. That's the point. If this pen emerged from him, but now has its own separation existence as a piece of godliness, nothing fighting God, as a godly entity, then there's a change. There's God plus a pen. But if this pen never left God's reality and is as one with God's reality now, as before God set it into being, then there's no change. And that's the point, that creation didn't change God, because his speech never left him. He said it, but it never left him. So therefore, there's no change from his perspective before he thought the words and after he said the words.
Thank you. Good.
Well, it's deep concepts. Any other questions? Thank you for that. I was glad I got a question. Any other questions? Okay, so let's continue. That these words, this energy is engarbed in them, in these forces of creation. The hachayosam, to give them life, because the energy of God is what vivifies all. It is what is all. Adesh dalshalos, through a progression that we've discussed before. Ve'ila la'alul, v'yiridas hamadregos. Ila la'alul is a certain fashion in which godliness evolves. Ila la'alul we can loosely translate as cause and effect, that from a higher godliness there emerges a smaller, lower godliness, from which emerges an even lower godliness, from which emerges an even lower godliness. I remember teaching this recently, a few weeks ago, this concept, Ila la'alul. V'yiridas hamadregos, and just the simple dissension of the levels. B'tzimtzumim rabim v'shonim, with many contractions and all different types of contractions to diminish and diminish and diminish the godly energy. Until all of the creations could receive their vitality and existence from him. And they would not cease to exist. Meaning, What the Rebbe is saying is, so God's speaking and pens exist. God's speaking and creation happens. From God's speech to the pen, there's a lot of levels. But it's all God's speech. So what are the levels? Does God then have other people that continue his conversation? No, it's just his words, just those 10 utterances. So how do I get from those 10 utterances to a pen? So the Rebbe says, because the words that are emerging from him, they'll never leave him, morph. Basically, the morphing is to get more and more and more diminished, to get covered over and squeezed inward and covered over and squeezed inward and squeezed out something, which gets covered over and which squeezes inward and which squeezes out something. All of these steps is to take God's energy and make it small enough to become a pen. A pen, a finite, lifeless piece of plastic. Imagine what happens to God's energy to become a pen. But it did. Because the only thing there is God's energy. So this pen is God's energy. But it took a lot of steps from God saying, let there be, to emerge this pen. And that's what the Rebbe is saying here. So don't get confused and say, well, that can't possibly be God's energy. I mean, that's a pen. It is. Because that energy went through many, many, many myriads and myriads and myriads and myriads and myriads of permutations, of contractions, of constrictions, lots of different types of squeezings to get small enough to become a human, to get a lot smaller to be an animal, to be a lot smaller to be a smaller animal, to be a lot smaller to be like a fish, to be a lot smaller to be like a plant, to be a lot smaller to be a pen. So many, many, many levels, but don't get confused. However small that godliness is, it's absolutely still one thing, him. And it's not him plus a pen. It's all him. So the pen and everything else are varying energies that are him. That's what the Rebbe is saying here. Now, why is this necessary to squeeze so much? So the Rebbe says, because if God wasn't very careful about the process, we would have an experience that we, or the pens of the world, would have an experience called bittul b'metzias. What we mean by bittul b'metzias is we would cease to exist because we're so overwhelmed by the godly experience. The closest thing in our world that sort of is akin to this is what the Jews experienced by the giving of the Torah. So when the Jews received the Torah, it says that with each godly utterance, their souls flew out of them, which means they die. Your soul is they die. And then God sent the angels with the dew that revives the dead, woke us up, put our souls back in our body, and he started speaking again and again. The souls just flew out. Why? Because it was like such a force, it was like a magnet, that every soul just got swooped into this magnet of God's intense energy. That's called bittul b'metzias. We cease to exist, we die. We're told that the tzaddik, the holiest person, the holiest Jew, that's his struggle. I mean, his struggle isn't, should I go for the cheeseburger? That's not my struggle. Sure, it's not his struggle. His struggle isn't to gossip or not to gossip, to space out during prayers or not to space out during prayers, to give generously or give with a bad feeling. Those aren't his struggles. So what are his struggles? I mean, everyone's got a struggle. What are his struggles? His struggles are to stay alive in this world because he's feeling it. He's so God sensitive. He feels that big, huge force that his soul is just drawn to leave his body and become one with, but he's not allowed to do that because God doesn't want. So his struggle is to stay in this world. There's a famous incident with the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, who we refer to as the Alter Rebbe, whose work we are studying. This is his work, the Tanya. Says that once he was learning a very deep concept, Kabbalistic, Hasidic concept, And he literally felt his soul leaving his body. He knew he was going to die, but he knows God doesn't want that. He at the moment wanted to die. I mean, his soul just wants to leave. So just let it go. But he knows it's not what God wants. So it says he ran into the kitchen and he took like a bagel, put in it butter, like butter meaning like a very physical, this world, rich, heavy thing, so to speak, a big anchor. And he started eating it to stay grounded. And that his soul should stay on planet Earth inside his body because it was just so leaving him. Again, that's the challenge of the most holy. Challenge is called Klois HaNefesh, the exploration of the soul. And it's akin to this concept that the godliness is so intense. How can we remain as we are? The wonder of Mashiach, the wonder that will just be by Mashiach, and maybe to us it will just be natural, so we won't even be wondered by it. But the wonder is that God will be completely revealed and we will all exist. When God somewhat revealed himself by the giving of the Torah, we all died. God is going to completely reveal himself, nothing withheld. And we will exist, the world will exist, the physicality will exist, the galaxies will exist. We will all be able to handle it. That's the most hugest miracle of Mashiach. But that's why, because at the moment, we don't want the pen to lose its existence in divine ecstasy, the godliness has to get more squeezed and more squeezed and more squeezed and more covered and more squeezed and more pulled out. So it can become so small, so it can become a pen. And the pen stays a pen and doesn't just expire in divine ecstasy. And so therefore, every constriction is a form of concealment. Now, the term hester panim, which we could translate as concealment, really means hester is concealing. Panim means the face. Oh, Hebrew, the holy tongue, is very precise in its holiness. So panim means face. If I change the vowels, the word is pnim, which means inward, because your face expresses your inner reality. Panim, face, pinim, the exact same Hebrew letters. I just put different vowels on it. Pnim, you might think of the word pnimi or pnimiut, pnimius, which means the inner dimension. So your face expresses your inner dimension. So hester panim, concealing the face, means concealing the inner energy. So God's energy is absolutely vivifying this pen. This pen is God's energy. It's not energy that left God and became a pen. It's energy that's still within God and is a pen. But what happened was the face of the energy, the pnimius, the inner energy, the most powerful, potent energy is covered over. So what's left is external levels that could become a pen, but are still absolutely God.
So is this why Hashem actually conceals himself in order to protect us?
Absolutely.
Right?
In order for existence to be, if Hashem didn't conceal himself, existence couldn't be.
Right.
And so we say in this world, we have a unique ability because we are so blinded to godliness. And that unique ability is, in a sense, to touch the godliness. The only way we can touch it is because we don't feel a thing. Because we're so covered over. There's so many barriers, so many layers, so much squeezing and concealing and contractions and coverings. I'm so out of my godly sensitivity that when I do a mitzvah, when I do a commandment, God and I become one. And I don't feel a thing. Right now, we are all doing a commandment. It's the commandment of learning God's Torah. If you're spacing out on me and snoozing behind your screen, it doesn't count. But if you're here and you're listening and your mind is processing, you are right now doing an incredibly holy commandment. In a sense, the holiest of all commandments, to learn God's Torah. The deepest secrets of God's Torah is what you're right now being exposed to. And you don't feel a thing. What do I mean you don't feel a thing? You're inspired, you understand it, you're enhanced by it. All that's true. But if you actually felt what right now is going on, God's essence and your soul are touching, you would cease to exist, which would not be very productive, would not be very mitafked, wouldn't be very functional. If every time we serve God, we cease to exist, it would not be very functional existence, or we wouldn't be able to serve God, or you could serve God once and then you're gone, and God would have to recreate you for you to serve him again. So we have the unique ability to touch God, that the Jew and God's essence are one every time we serve him. And how can we have that experience? Because we don't feel a thing. And that's why we can stay alive and have the experience.
So different people would have different level of concealment. For example, you're teaching every day.
No, we all have the same concealment. Everything that is within this physical world had to go through a conveyor belt called klipas noiga, meaning even items of kedusha, to get into this world, they had to be put in a bag, put in a film, put in a, like a plastic I put over them, called klipas noiga. Everything in this world. That's the only way you can enter into this world. And that film makes us not feel a thing. And that's why we could experience it. So in all of the higher worlds, like all of what we call the spiritual world, Asiya, Yetzira, Bria, Atzilus, they can't get what we're getting because they would feel it. And since they would feel it, they would cease to exist. So even the lowest spiritual world, which is a world called Asiya, which means action, it's the lowest of the spiritual worlds, but it's still a spiritual reality. It still feels and sees and experiences godliness. So if God's essence touched Asiya, bang, it's gone. No way it could contain itself. No way it could exist as a separate, seemingly separate existence. But me, I could be in contact with God's essence all day. I'm clueless, so no problem. There's like a story, sort of famous-ish, like a science fiction type story of some planet, some world, where they saw in the history, very developed, civilized world, like high level society, that once every, 1,000 some years, something happens and the whole world goes crazy. And the only one that survives are the children and the simpletons. And then from those children and simpletons, the world gets rebuilt. And it lasts and develops itself. And then in 1,000 some years, the same thing happens again. So here are the scientists and the biggest minds of this world trying to protect themselves from this thing they know is going to happen, because they've seen historically it happen. But they cut the story short. They don't succeed. Why? Because what happens? Because once in every 1,000 some years, night falls on planet XYZ. And any intelligent person, any sophisticated person, any developed person experiences this enveloping darkness. My computer's going dark as we talk. Effect to my story. Experiences this enveloping darkness and goes crazy. They can't handle one night of darkness because they've never experienced it their entire life, because in this world the sun never sets. Who can survive? The children. What do they know to know? And the very, very, very simple people. What do they know to know? So they survive, and everyone of more intelligence goes crazy. I'm using that as a mushal, as a parable for this concept. We're those children and simpletons. We're so covered over. Our sensitivities are so blocked. Our cores are so cloaked over. We experience it, we don't feel a thing, so we can experience it. But any higher reality would experience it, and therefore would cease to exist. So that's the advantage of this state, and that's why God created it this way. And I'm saying the enormous miracle, innovation, unbelievable, inexplicable transformation by Mashiach is we're going to experience it, we're going to feel it, we will have no barriers, and we'll continue to exist.
So what about concealment to Mashiach?
Concealment, there will be no concealments by the time of Mashiach.
No. I'm talking about Mashiach himself. So God remains concealed until he decides that Mashiach has to be revealed.
Until the
And
complete revelation, Mashiach's revelation is in stages. God remains concealed until the complete revelation of Mashiach.
Got you.
Any other questions? Okay, so we are done. This week is Parashas Pinchas. Pinchas, of course, is a very Mashiach portion. As we say, Pinchas is a reincarnation of Elijah, Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, whose job it is to tell the world of the coming of Mashiach. It says that 3 days before the coming of Mashiach, Eliyahu, Elijah, will go to the city of Tiberias, of Tiberia, and announce to all the people that Mashiach is coming. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe said many years ago in the 1990s that he's already there and already saying these words. We don't have to worry that Elijah hasn't come yet. He's already come. So that's Pinchas. The energy of Pinchas is the energy of Elijah, of Eliyahu Hanavi. So in this week, in 1991, I'm looking for it. Sorry. It's a very, very Mashiach speech. Let's see what they pulled out here from it. The Rebbe says, standing as we are so close before the revelation of redemption, each Jew has to accustom himself to redemption and to put himself in a situation of redemption, in a feeling space of redemption, because he should make his day a redemption day. He should be living Mashiach, so this is already a Mashiach day. He should make his place a Mashiach place. He should make his place like his own personal Israel. Because wherever he is, even if he's stuck in Chicago, it's not Chicago, it's Israel. Because he made it holy. He invested his thoughts in godliness. He invested his speech in godliness. He invested his actions in godliness. So this place has become a miniature Israel, even though he's in Chicago. And when a person does this, the world reflects it. Like we have this concept, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe said to a Jew that wanted to go to Israel, and the Tzaddik answered him, Machda Eretz Yisrael, make wherever you are Israel. Israel means a place of this very high level revelation of God. Awesome. You could do it in Russia. Machda Eretz Yisrael. Wherever you are, make that place a place where God is revealed. Make wherever you are Israel. And when we do this, when we live this, when we talk about this, and when more than our words, our example conveys this message, then everyone else around us also gets it. When you live a Geula life, a life that is in tune with the energies of redemption, and then you speak to other people about living such a life, they hear you. One, because what you're saying is true. Two, because what you're saying comes from your heart. And three, because they see you're living it. And that you're living it is the most powerful words you can give them to impact them, that they should want to live this way as well. Does someone have something they'd like to share? Something nice that happened to them this week that they'd like to thank God for? There's always so much to thank God for. It's hard to put a finger on it, right? Anything you can think of?
Hi, it's Dottie. Hi.
Hey, Dottie, I'm so glad you were able to join us this week. Last week you were busy, so it's nice you were able to come back.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. This is concerning the recent tragedy that happened in Miami Beach, and Leah Fuhau was actually, I have a special relationship with her. And the fact that her father's body and mother were found intact is such a miracle. And he had donated a Sefer Torah to the Mesivta. And he was such a wonderful guy. And I met the mother a few times. So the miracle was that she was able to find her father and bury him in a most holy way. And we were all like crying and feeling her pain, but there was a closure. And that was a miracle. That was a miracle because there's 100 people that haven't been found. So that was a miracle because we felt her pain and her, so that I thought that was a very big miracle.
That's such a beautiful take on it. You are so right. There's 150 people that haven't been found, I think. And it's about, I don't know, I didn't check today. As of yesterday, it was like 11 they found. So that is beautiful. And there are other miracles coming out from there as well. People that were supposed to be there and left and weren't there. And you're right. But you're right. That's a beautiful way to look at it and say, God, thank you for the kindness. That's
And
really
it was so fabulous. Also, a Lubavitch lady had gone to a Farbrengen because from the Thomas Brangen, from the Frierdiker Rebbe, because she came home late from the Farbrengen. She was still up. She wasn't sound asleep like everybody else. She came home late, felt the tremors in the building, grabbed her kids and left moments before the collapse.
literally as it was collapsing. Yes, I heard that. I read
The
it.
Farbrengen saved her life because she went and she was up.
And she was
And
up.
another Israeli family also. Mamash, few seconds before it happened, they just took the kids and ran out, and Baruch Hashem, but so many didn't. So
And so many didn't. And so you see the ones that did, you see the ones that didn't. There was a family from Borough Park that New Yorkers that were supposed to be that had rented an apartment in that complex, in that column, and they flew that day. They were supposed to be sleeping there that night. And they got to the apartment and it wasn't set up properly. And the woman said, I don't want to sleep here like this. Forget it. We're going to go to a hotel. I can't deal with this now. And tomorrow we'll come and we'll organize everything. Oh, I mean, come on. Why should we go? No, we're paying for this apartment. No, I want to go to a hotel. Tomorrow I'll deal with this. I don't want to deal with this now. Okay, whatever, fine. They went to a hotel that night.
Baruch Hashem.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's just unbelievable. And yet there's a lot of we need Abishter, we need Mashiach now. In case we thought it was okay, Gullus. So I don't know how anyone can think it was okay after Corona and Black Lives Matter riots and
Meron
elections and Meron and Carlin and Gaza and Lutz. I don't know how anyone really could be thinking that it's okay. But if somehow we just slip, like we're traumatized and terrified, and then we just like space out and continue living our life and forget about it, God says, come on, no. Golus is not okay. Exile is not okay. Exile is not okay. I'm not going to let you think it's okay. It's horrible. And just stop this. Remember, you have to bring Mashiach now. Don't be comfortable, because this is not a comfortable existence and nobody's comfortable. So don't pretend you're comfortable, because we sort of like get used to it. Like imagine somebody who, I don't know, the air gradually becomes more and more toxic, but little by little. So you get used to it being polluted, and then you get used to being a little more polluted, and then you get used to it being a little more polluted, and then it just gets more and more and more, and you just keep adjusting to this, horribly polluted environment. That's like us. We just get used to it. It's not good. There's problems, there's stress, there's tension. Every day has new fears and new worries, but we just think that's life. God says that's not supposed to be life. So you think exile's okay? Let me remind you. And then we should.
Well, there is a great movement of enlightenment by Jews and non-Jews all over the world, getting up and opposing those governments and all these things that are going on around the world, and you see it coming out. So you can really see how the evil and the good are really, really separating. And so, things are happening, And Bezrat Hashem, we just need
Bezrat
to,
Hashem, we need to stay focused and we need Mashiach now.
yeah, exactly.
But Dottie, thank you for sharing that miracle. That was such a heartwarming take. That was so beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cyril. Thank you.
Thank you so
Anyone
much.
have something they wanted to add? Okay, so we will end on this point. Thank you so much for joining. We should have a wonderful week. We shouldn't see tragedies. We should see God's
Amen.
blessings. We shouldn't have to work hard to understand them. It should be so revealed and obvious. We should just
Amen.
be rejoicing in God's goodness and kindness to the entire world.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Thank